Have you ever stopped to wonder what a highly processed, aluminum packaged TV dinner could possibly have in common with a classic American novel? I mean, it sounds like the setup to a weird joke, right? But the answer is actually a really profound key to understanding the American identity. Because both the food on our plates and the words on our pages are direct reflections of exactly who we were, what we feared, and what we hoped for at any given point in history.
So, welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to guide you through this today. We're going to take a chronological journey, literally tracing the soul of America through its culinary habits and its literary movements. It's just a fascinating way to look at history. By seeing how physical and intellectual nourishment evolved side by side, we can unlock a totally new understanding of American culture.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is the roadmap for today. We're starting with native roots and traditions, then moving into colonial survival and the Enlightenment. After that, we'll hit 19th century growth and Gothic literature, transition into modernism and the industrial diet, and then finally wrap the whole thing up with post-war culture and convenience.
All right, part one, native roots and traditions. Long before European ships ever crossed the Atlantic, indigenous peoples had this incredibly rich, really symbiotic connection with their environment, which completely shaped both their diets and their stories. Just to ground us in the timeline a bit, Native American cultural and culinary traditions thrived across vastly diverse bioregions for literally thousands of years before the 1600s. We see this documented a bit later, like in the 1620s in the writings of Plymouth Plantation, and eventually intersecting with the English language in the 1700s when figures like the Mohegan Reverend Samson Occam began publishing. But the foundational practices, those go back millennia. Now notice the profound parallel here between how native peoples farmed and how they told stories. Agriculturally, a lot of tribes practice companion planting with what's called the three sisters. That's beans, maize, and squash. They plant them together because they grow in perfect harmony, literally supporting one another. And we see that exact same structured, nature-reverent harmony in their oral literature. Native folktales and creation myths heavily feature the repetition of culturally significant numbers. Usually it's 4, representing the cardinal directions, or 7, which is the cardinal directions plus skyward, earthward, and center. So their food and their storytelling were both deeply rooted in the physical orientation of the earth itself. And you've got to appreciate how brilliantly resourceful their culinary techniques were. Because they lacked fireproof pottery, a lot of tribes used a technique that anthropologists call stone boiling. It's exactly what it sounds like. You heat rocks in a fire, drop them straight into a pot of water, and use that rapid boiling to steam hunted game or root vegetables. This technique, along with preserving meat as pemmican to survive long winters, really shows this incredible adaptability to the land, a survival theme that deeply, deeply permeates early indigenous oral histories.
Moving on to Section 2, Colonial Survival and Enlightenment.
So this era was defined by some really gritty adaptation to a new world, which eventually led to the patriotic reason and independent spirit of the American Revolution. Notice how the shift from the 1600s to the 1700s brought immense changes. We go from the early English colonies desperately just trying to survive to the mid-1700s where distinct culinary identities are being documented in cookbooks like Hannah Glass's, all the way to 1789. And 1789 is a huge year because it saw the publication of William Hill Brown's The Power of Sympathy, which is widely recognized as the very first American novel.
And these shifting identities quickly built into very distinct regional cultures. Honestly, geography completely dictated the diet. Up north, the growing seasons were super short, and wheat just wouldn't easily grow. So colonists relied heavily on cornmeal, hunting seasonal game, and catching coastal seafood, usually washing it all down with rum and beer. But down south, the climate allowed for almost year-round farming. They relied heavily on pork thanks to early Spanish introductions of pigs, and drank whiskey distilled from all that abundant corn. This whole mindset is perfectly captured in Hannah Glass's massively popular 1747 cookbook. Her quote here shows this fierce, almost stubborn pride and a total disdain for fussy French culinary influence. Actually, it's fascinating because this practical, no-nonsense approach to food perfectly mirrored the colonial literature of the time. Writers were hyper-focused on practical accounts of history, religious Puritanism, and eventually, the fiercely independent, rational arguments of the Enlightenment that fueled the Revolution. Basically, they wanted plain food and plain truth.
All right, Section 3, 19th century growth and Gothic.
This was an explosive century. It was marked by rapid westward expansion, highly self-sufficient farming, and a deeply, deeply fractured intellectual identity.
Looking at the timeline, the 1820s bring European Romanticism over to American shores. By the 1850s, the distinctly American transcendentalist movement hits its peak. But as the century grinds on, culminating in the horrific devastation of the Civil War, we see a massive shift into deep literary skepticism.
But before we get too deep into the philosophy, let's look at the actual reality of eating in the 1800s. American farms were incredibly self-sufficient. Sure, you might buy salt or coffee at a general store, but the grueling daily work of food processing and preservation, that fell entirely on the family. We're talking relentless canning of vegetables, pickling and drying fruits, pressing cider to make apple butter, and boiling pork scraps with cornmeal to make a thick porridge called pawnhouse or scrapple. It was a gritty, labor-intensive pork and beans reality out there on the expanding frontier.
Yet at the exact same time people were boiling pork scraps just to survive the winter, American writers were developing our first notable intellectual movement, transcendentalism. Writers like Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson were out there advocating for these lofty ideals, believing in the inherent goodness of people and nature, and preaching the power of self-reliance to transcend society's corrupting influence.
So the crucial point here is this fascinating split personality of the 19th century. It's like a giant puzzle. On one side, you have optimistic transcendentalist literature, like Thoreau's Walden, soaring alongside the beauty of nature. But on the other side, reacting to the exact same expanding, chaotic nation, you have the American Gothic movement. Writers like Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne channeled frontier anxiety, the fear of the unknown, and later the decaying plantations of the South, into these dark, terrifying tales. Optimism and deep anxiety, growing right next to each other. Section 4, Modernism and the Industrial Diet. Now this is where things take a major turn. This is where science radically alters what we eat, while global conflict radically alters how we think. Looking at the early 1900s, industrialization was literally everywhere. In 1906, public concern over adulterated industrialized food led to the Pure Food and Drug Act. By the 1920s, a totally disillusioned, lost generation of writers emerged from the trauma of World War I. And by the 1930s, food wasn't just regulated, it was scientifically engineered. Think about milk being fortified with synthetic vitamin D in 1932. But the literary shift actually began just after the Civil War with literary realism. Mark Twain's vigorous, colloquial style in works like The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was a massive shot across the bow at tired conventions. He captured life exactly as it was without the romantic fluff, and that raw realism laid the essential groundwork for American modernism. Following World War I, expatriate writers like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald stripped away the romanticism entirely, capturing the pain, the loss of direction, and the raw reality of a rapidly modernizing world. But here's the twist. While literature was stripping away illusions to find raw truth, the food industry was doing the exact opposite, using science to sanitize, process, and package nature. Just look at milk. What was once this seasonal, highly perishable rural product was completely industrialized. Milking machines lowered farm costs. Pasteurization and homogenization made it safe. Then, distribution expanded massively in glass bottles and cartons. Finally, it was fortified with synthetic vitamins, turning it into a year-round, scientifically perfect staple for the rapidly urbanizing masses. The diet became safer, for sure, but highly, highly processed. Which brings us to Section 5, Post-War Culture and Convenience. This relentless push for convenience brings us to the 1950s and beyond, a period where the relationship between what we eat and what we read gets incredibly paradoxical. The post-war era ushered in an age of mass prosperity and radically altered American consumer habits. In the 1950s, we see the rise of ultra-convenient TV dinners occurring at the exact same time as the overtly countercultural Beat generation in literature. And as we move into the late 20th century, we see an explosion of postmodernism that continues to critique American culture right up to the present day. And this highlights the ultimate irony of modern American culture. On the one hand, the post-war diet became remarkably safe, highly processed, and completely sanitized for television, literally frozen in aluminum trays requiring zero effort. Yet, as the mainstream diet became more conventional and packaged, American literature rebelled entirely. Postmodern literature became fractured, subversive, sexually frank, and totally obsessed with breaking taboos through unreliable narrators and distorted timelines. It's wild. The safer the food got, the more dangerous the art became.
So when we step back and look at this vast timeline, from the resourceful stone boiling of Native American tribes all the way to the flash frozen aluminum convenience meals of the 1950s, the takeaway is crystal clear. We truly are what we eat and what we read. Physical nourishment and intellectual nourishment don't just exist in a vacuum. They are a constant, evolving response to the environment, the technology, and the deep anxieties of their historical moment.
Which leaves us with this final, truly fascinating question to ponder. As we live today in an era of instant delivery fast food, heavily engineered snacks, and entirely fragmented, bite-sized digital media, what will this specific combination say about our culture to future historians looking back at us? It is definitely something to chew on the next time you scroll through a feed while eating takeout. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. Keep